On June 4th, 1983, my high school was one of many that took us to Disneyland for Grad Night. If you've ever been to Disneyland on Grad Night, you know how much fun and crazy it can be. The park stays open extra late. The skippers who drive around the jungle cruise boats let loose, tell dirty jokes. And there's plenty of opportunities for people to sneak booze and weed in. Getting a bunch of amped high school teenagers in a Disneyland is one thing, but with the nightlife and party atmosphere behind it, things can get pretty nuts. My two friends and I, Anaheim locals, were particularly excited. We all loved Disneyland, and while we didn't visit often, living particularly in the park's backyard gave us more opportunities than most. In addition, we haven't been since the new Fantasyland opened earlier that year. It went from sort of a medieval fairground to a storybook village, so I kind of was looking forward to that. Unlike a lot of people who were there, we intended to keep things clean and have a grand old time with it. Hit up as many rides as possible and just revel. But the big plan for the night was kind of ambitious and maybe a little reckless. To this day, I can't remember who suggested that idea. Only that we all thought it was a great idea. We had already gotten into the park and gone on a number of rides when it was brought up. While we were sitting on a bench in Frontierland eating churros, from where we were, we could look across the rivers of America to Tom Sawyer Island and past where the river curved to New Orleans Square. Poking above the trees was the cupola of the Haunted Mansion with its clipper ship weather vane. The sun had just gone down, and the sky was awash with a dull orange and purple clouds, most of which seemed to loom behind the cupola. I pointed out just how perfect and spooky the whole thing looked. That just got us talking. The mansion was a collective favorite, and being dumb kids, we all agreed to do a little exploring, to effectively spend the night in the Haunted Mansion. We all laughed as we all got in line, moving past the brick columns and up the walk toward the museum. But inside, I was a bit nervous. You have to understand, security was a bit lax back then, so it was possible for us to pull this off if we were careful. Plus, Grad Night always had kids getting into trouble, and the likelihood of us getting banned for good was not as high as it could have been. But I still felt tense, the feeling you get when you're scared and about to go on a thrill ride for the first time. Excited but hesitant. The three of us, Mike, Karen, and myself, had it all worked out. When you first enter the mansion, you're escorted into a room that seems to stretch and warp before your very eyes, which is actually an elevator that takes guests below ground, where a hallway connects to the right building beyond the park's berm. As everyone crowded out of the room and into the hall of morphing portraits, we lagged behind, which the disembodied voice of the ghost jokingly warns you not to do, and fell into the very back of the line. By the time we piled into our doom buggy, there was no one else behind us, and the black endless procession of clamshell-like cars were empty. We went through the ride as normal, cracking jokes, making banter at all the familiar scenes, until we reached the exit crypt. We stepped out onto a moving platform and walked towards the escalator ramp that leads from the crypt to the park outside. If you don't know, the escalator hugs a wall on the right, but on the left is a small crypt scene where a tiny ghostly bride stands on a stone shelf, tells you to hurry back, hurry back. Mike took the charge here, deliberately turning backwards as we went up to watch the cast member near the buggies below us. Mike's a big, broad-shouldered guy, a football player through and through, and his bulk hid me and Karen from view. At his signal, when the cast member monitoring the exit had turned his back, Karen and I had climbed over the rail and dropped down into the crypt scene, where we quickly scurried under the dusty space below the escalator. Mike was over with us a moment later, and we laughed and congratulated each other on a job well done. We might have spent a good hour or so down there giggling into our hands whenever we heard footsteps and voices, overheard of suspecting people exiting the ride. Karen even had some snacks she brought with her, and we just sat there in the dark, ate, whispered to each other. It was like being in a weird clubhouse, and it felt good that the three of us shared this delinquency together. Even as the narration of the Ghost Ride bride looped over and over it again. Hurry back, hurry back. Be sure to bring your death certificate. If you decide to join us, make your final arrangements now. We've been dying to have you. Eventually the novelty wore off and we got quiet and then listless. Sure, we'd managed this much, but now what? Karen pointed out that it'd been eerily silent for a while, other than the monotonous speech of the ghost bride and the other ambient noises. Mike said he thought maybe the park closed, but that made no sense because it was open all night on grad night. Not wanting to get in trouble, but also wondering what was going on, I volunteered to clamber back up and take a look. When I did, using some of the crypt scenery for hand and footholds, I saw there was no one around, not even a cast member down at the unloading platform at the end. When I reported this, Mike and Karen climbed back up as well, and we went down to the unloading station to look around. All the doom buggies coming along the corridor was empty, and there was not a person in sight. It was odd, and I felt like something was definitely off for the place to be so empty. I was about to suggest turning around and heading back outside when Mike said he's always wondered where the doom buggies went after they drop you off. They rounded a dark corner in the crypt area and vanished from sight, and Mike was curious what was down there. Now really, I should have said no, there was no point. We could get in some serious trouble if we snooped around back there. It was probably just a utility corridor anyway, since the buggies looped back around to the loading room, but I was young and stupid, and when presented with a golden opportunity like that, it was hard to pass up. So we went ahead and jumped into a doom buggy going by, and it slowly rounded the corner into darkness. This was uncharted territory for us, even if it turned out to be boring back there. At the very least, we'd get a chance to see it and maybe get another ride out of it. Hardly a day goes by where I regret not having said anything. The main thing I remember was how Spartan it was. It wasn't quite pitch black, but it was even gloomier in there than the rest of the ride. There were small lights set into the walls on either side of the track, but they were very low to the ground and far between. The walls were painted black, and the corridor seemed so narrow that I felt boxed in. It was quiet too, other than the hum of the track moving the buggies. I felt tense, and Mike and Karen were not helping that, because they looked just as tense. I think it was dawning on all of us just how much trouble we were gonna get in. And it had passed like this, us going down that dark, featureless backstage corridor, when the ride suddenly stopped. I nearly jumped out of my skin as a voice came from somewhere overhead, and laughed when I realized I'd just been startled by the normal breakdown spiel. Playful spooks have interrupted our tour. The recording went. Please maintain seated in your doom buggy. We will proceed in just a moment. The teasing was immediate, as we all pointed out to each other how we'd all jumped. We waited for the ride to start again, and every 30 seconds or so the spiel would play. We have appointedly been detained by prankish spirits. Kindly remain in your doom buggy. We will continue on our tour momentarily. This went on for a good long while, 10, maybe 15 minutes, and still the buggies haven't moved. No one came looking for us. We were getting antsy, and the silence between the announcements was becoming unsettling. Then Karen leaned over a bit and looked around. She noticed the door first. Just ahead, past the buggy in front of us, work lights revealed a little clove in the utility door on the right-hand side of the corridor. We were so sick of being in a buggy by that point. We were willing to try anything. So, after a short discussion, we squeezed out of the buggy, pressed against the wall to go past the next one. Mike had some trouble here and stood before the door. I pushed it open, finding it unlocked. It opened to a metal staircase leading into the darkness, footlights like the one leading into the corridor, revealing where to go. As we went down the stairs, I was thinking up excuses in my head, To explain why, we were likely stepping into Disney's underground utility corridors. The infamous utilidors, said to run like a spiderweb beneath Disneyland. If someone found us by this point, I really hope they did. At the bottom of the stairs was another closed door with a sign on it, reading cast members only. We pushed through that as well, and we were legitimately surprised to see it open into what looked like a themed hallway. Disney, even backstage, seemed to be paying attention to style, as this hall sported the purple demon wallpaper and the wainscoting of the rooms above. It was even lit by candle sconces on the walls. The fake flickering bulbs were coated with cobwebs and dust. Several detailed wooden doors lined the hall, with out-of-place white placards mounted on them. Each was marked as a prop room with a corresponding number. As we made our way up the hall, we tried each door we came to and found each of them locked. The first door, prop room 1, shook a bit but didn't bulge. Same with 2 and 3. Mike chuckled and said he wondered if we would find Walt Disney's frozen head down here, but I could hear a bit of nervous waver in his laugh. Even I was feeling some sense of dread with each door we tried. Something out of place but nagging. At door 4, I put my ear to the edge of it and thought I heard something that sounded like rushing water or faint TV static from the other side. And at 5, I noticed that the faux candles flanking it were flickering more sporadically than the rest, like they were faulty. Door 6 to the left and near another plain utility door that marked the hall's end was the only one that yielded to us, and I was the one who turned the cold handle and opened it for the first time. It's difficult for me to describe what I saw in there without shuddering, because even now, my telling makes it sound fairly normal. That is, as normal as a room hidden under a theme park attraction can possibly be. It wasn't very big, almost like a large storage shed. Unlike the hall, this was a blind utility back and lit by a single fluorescent light in the ceiling, albeit a dim one. The walls were lined with metal cabinets and there was some sort of large, archaic gadget shoved in one corner. Not unlike the old computer banks from the 60s, but what caught my attention right away was a grinning figure near the far wall. A dummy or animatronic of some sort, lifeless and unmoving, but standing on its base. The discovery was fascinating to all of us, and without thinking, we edged into the room and immediately approached the figure. It was clearly meant to be a ghost for one of the rides. A specter in a top hat with a skull-like face, cartoonly bulging eyes, and a leering smile. One of the teeth was even painted gold. He stood in a bow-legged stance, and one gnarled hand holding a cane and the other holding a hat box. None of us had ever seen this particular character on the ride before, though Karen said its face looked a lot like the tall, skinny hitchhiking ghost from the end of the ride. I was just turning away from the figure to look at the cabins when there was a combustion roar from the hall outside, like the sound of a passing motorcycle, followed by a loud, bassy boom that made the floor shake. The door to the room swung shut, and the fluorescent light sputtered and went out, leaving us in total darkness. Mike gasped and Karen screamed, and I was just reaching out for them in the dark when I heard a particularly whirring sound. Another light went on. This one was green, concentrated above the hatbox ghost, showing its skeleton smile for a moment before the light faded and another faded on, illuminating the hatbox. I could see through the material of the hatbox now and noticed the ghost head grinning at me from the inside. The pattern repeated itself rhythmically, making it seem like the ghost head was disappearing from the shoulders and appearing in the hatbox. It wasn't a terribly convincing effect, but in the dark and with the strange things going on around me, it genuinely scared me. I turned and stumbled through the room, ready to get out of there, feeling around for the door. Now even the light on the ghost had shut off. I heard Karen and Mike's feet behind me, a crash, and the sound of something tapping the concrete floor. I tried to push open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something slammed into my back in the dark and caused me to hit it hard. I was dazed and unhurt, and another scream from Karen fueled my adrenaline even more. I instead gave the door a tug and opened it. I was out in the hall, without a second thought, without even looking back. I started running, sprinting back the way I came, gasping for air. I was never a very athletic kid, but panic kept me going. I heard sounds behind me, footsteps, Mike and Karen yelling in terror as they followed, and what seemed like rapid knocking and banging on the doors around me. But I refused to look over my shoulder. I was up the stairs and back into the doom buggy corridor in what felt like a matter of seconds. The doom buggies were moving now, endlessly traveling through the shadows. I knew it was risky to jump into one in this narrow corridor, and for a moment, I stopped, trying to figure out what to do. I finally looked back and down the stairway I had come from. I thought Mike and Karen had been right behind me, but they were gone. I called out their names, my voice echoing down the stairs, but there was no reply. Not until I heard something tapping the metal stairs, coming up toward the door, and saw an unfamiliar vague shadow on the wall, that I flung the door closed and dove into the nearest buggy, which carried me down the corridor a little ways before emerging into the limbo-like loading room. All the effects were still running here, including the eerie music and sounds, but there was no one else around. I yelled for help and no one appeared. As soon as I could, I jumped out of the doom buggy and ran back up the line, into the hall of morphing portraits. Ahead was the door to the elevator, the stretching gallery, but I remember the section had a more immediate check-in exit, meant for those too scared to ride the ride, who wanted to head back up to the park. The door was marked with an obvious exit sign, sitting between two shuttered windows that made it look like it led outside to a stormy night. Without hesitating, I pushed through that as well. Beyond that was another corridor with flashing lights on either side of me, pointed at the shadows to simulate lightning, flickering with each thunderclap that boomed through the hall, disorienting me even further. Turning left, I followed the hall as the floor inclined gently up, my throat tight as a stitch in my side, and then my throat closed altogether as I turned the corner and almost ran into the Hatbox Ghost. It was standing smack dab in the middle of the hall, between me and the door that led outside. I scrambled backward, instinctively, but the figure didn't move. It was a static prop, grinning its cadaver grin, backlit by a ceiling light further down the hall. The light also broke the illusion of the Hatbox, and I could see vaguely the shape of the disembodied head through the scrim. I was convinced, thoroughly convinced at that moment, that thing was suddenly going to jerk to life and come after me. But it didn't. I had no idea how it had gotten there from sub-level so quickly. Maybe the one I didn't see below wasn't the only figure. Maybe Mike and Karen were pulling a fast one on me, and had dragged it up here with them. I was frozen, trying to figure out what to do next, not wanting to go anywhere near the ghost, but not wanting to backtrack either. I still felt like there was something sinister behind me. Nervously, I croaked out the names of my lost friends, but there was no reply. Noises from the ride seemed to come flooding down the hall, muted but ever-present. Then, I heard the groan. It could have been a human groan or something mechanical, but I heard it. It didn't sound like any type of standard audio, but it came from a point somewhere near or past the Hatbox Ghost, maybe from further down the corridor past the exit. As if this were a trigger, I realized that either my eyes had adjusted to the dark, or the lighting had somehow changed, but I looked again at the Hatbox and saw the thing inside through the scrim. There was a head in there, but I know it wasn't a ghost head. There was a head in there, but I know it wasn't a ghost head. It wasn't a cartoon caricature of a head. It wasn't Mike or Karen. It's at this point, the details elude me. I know that what I saw shook me to my very core. And that's why the reason it's taken me so long to recount this. I remember seeing the thing in the box, seeing that it was indeed a human head, a man's face, a face I didn't recognize, seemingly looking back out at me with shocked, pleading eyes, but after that, there's a blur of sheer terror and snatches of frightening images, gnarled hands, tombstones, demonic hissing, the stretching room going in reverse, shrinking too fast, the ceiling rushing towards me, the corpse hanging in the rafters descending on me. I try not to dwell on them too much because now I'm no longer sure which really happened and which was the result of nightmares I'd have for years after. The next thing I can remember clearly after that is being on my hands and knees just outside the fence of the haunted mansion, vomiting onto the pavement, while around me crowds of people stood. Most of them weren't paying me any mind, but there were lots of them whispering, talking, and a few of them were crying. There were red and blue lights and police cars parked nearby, but I couldn't tell why. I just sat there gulping and sobbing until a cast member finally noticed me and led me to a first aid station. Karen was there when I arrived, and she jumped and hugged me tight as she saw me. I don't think either of us made much sense. We were both at our wits' end, but it was such a relief to see her, and any questions I had fell by the wayside. I never forgot how haunted she looked. Wide-eyed and pale, barely able to form a sentence without tearing up. Mike never turned up. That fateful night has never left me, and in the years since, I've slowly begun to piece together the details, trying to vainly make sense of what happened. It became sort of a private obsession, something to do in the background as I moved along with my life. First, it didn't take long for Karen and I to learn why the police cars were there. It wasn't for us. According to the reports we heard later, an 18-year-old guy from New Mexico had died while we were in a haunted mansion. He and a friend had snuck into the backstage area on Tom Sawyer's Island and stole a rubber emergency boat to go for a joyride around the rivers of America. Apparently this guy was pretty drunk, and it wasn't long before he hit a rock, throwing he and his friend from the boat. His friend tried to get help, but he drowned before they could find him. His body was discovered an hour later. I want to know if that's why there was no one when we were in the crypt backstage. I managed to track down a few cast members who were working that night, and though most of them claimed they were told by management to not cause alarm and keep to their posts, several admitted that they had gone to check out the grim spectacle, especially those CMs that were on attractions near the river, like the Haunted Mansion. It was a timing such that everyone turned a blind eye while we stumbled across something hideous. Mike's disappearance was something Karen and I both deeply felt and tried for years to get something from anyone about it. His parents never heard from him, and a missing report was never filed. We didn't tell the truth, but who would believe us? We at least tried to steer the investigation toward the Haunted Mansion, saying that was the last place we saw him, but it never went that far. Disney never got implicated in the incident, of course, though the park was his last known whereabouts. Karen and I eventually drifted apart, probably because we blamed each other for what happened. She never expressed to me what she experienced after we were separated, either because she wanted me to feel guilty for leaving them behind. Oh, Karen, you have no idea. Or that she, like me, can only recall so much. We were both too shaken to recount each other. But time and distance made things easier, and with the advent of the internet, there was suddenly a wealth of new information to discover. I since began to piece together clues. Almost immediately, I found our Hatbox Ghost. Plugging into any search engine will turn up multitudes of pictures of that bow-legged grinning figure that has often floated through my mind in the dark. Apparently it was part of some attraction that opened in 1969. Much of the promotional material of the ride at the time featured this character and his ubiquitous hatbox. He originally stood in the attic scene right across from the ghostly bride with a beating heart, but was quietly removed from the ride only after a week. Apparently the effect of his disappearing had never worked properly, or so the official account goes. In recent years, the Hatbox Ghost has gained a fan base. Groups of Haunted Mansion fans that wanted to see him restored to the ride. It's wishful thinking, I'm sure, but because that figure had to have been stored downstairs for a reason. That empty corridor, not originally meant to be for guests, disabled guests, however, traveled that route all the time. Wheelchair access to that ride is done through the limbo-like loading room, and then guests travel back and forth to this room to reclaim their wheelchairs and head back out. I posted about it and posted queries for details about that area, but no one has given me a description that sounds anything like what I went through. It's been described as short, bland, and with some sort of catwalk going over the track, but no mysterious clove or obvious doorway. It takes less than 30 seconds for the doom buggies to go through, and then you're back in the loading room. I suspect Disney might have changed their area since the 80s, but why? Most recently though, I've come across an old factoid that seems more like a morbid curiosity than anything else, unless one has been through what I have. It's not about the Haunted Mansion, however, but its nearby e-ticket neighbor, Pirates of the Caribbean. According to the story, and this has been published in various Disney-owned books, so it's no vague rumor, the Imagineers of the time who built the ride felt the faux skeletons of the time weren't convincing enough for the underground grotto scenes, so they borrowed real human remains from the UCLA Medical Center, dressed them up as real pirates, and put them in the caves. Let that sink in for a second. Millions of people went by on boats, had no idea they were looking at real skeletons, all propped up in pirate garb. Eventually, a later team of Imagineers would place these with more convincing facsimiles, and supposedly, the bones were returned to their country of origins and given proper burial. But who's to say they were? What if something was left behind in that basement when the bones were taken? And what if Pirates wasn't the only ride that did this? The show building of the Haunted Mansion was built along with the rest of the New Orleans Square in 1963. But it took another 6 years for the actual attraction to open. Why the delay? It could have been just a gridlock from the 1964 World's Fair and Walt Disney's death in '66, could it? All this speculation is a string of understanding that raises more questions than answers for me. I want to get the truth of what happened that night, but everything I found doesn't add up to a concrete explanation. Perhaps there isn't one, though I desperately want there to be. And I can't go back. I won't. Not after the things I saw and felt. I haven't set foot in Disneyland since that night. Maybe, though, maybe it's time I tried again. And Karen, if you're out there reading this, hearing this message, I'm so sorry about everything. I'm trying to make it right, trying to put some meaning to this. Contact me if you can. I need to know what happened between you and Mike. Maybe you have the key to unlock this mystery in your memories. I can't do it alone, but together, we might get to the bottom of this. For everyone else, let this stand as a testament. Some things are backstage for a reason, and a company like Disney must have a multitude of skeletons in its closet. Think twice before you pull some stupid stunt like I did, because it might not be security that finds you. If you enjoyed my narration, please consider subscribing. And stay tuned for more stories on the King Prince channel.